opens diagonals, staking a claim for central influence and preparing piece development. An immediate Sicilian territorial dispute, challenging white's central ambition with asymmetrical pawn play. Securing the center and preparing kingside development, this knight leap immediately challenges black's Sicilian structure, aiming for active piece play. Developing a knight to a central square like c6 is a flexible and standard response, preparing for further pawn advances and reinforcing the d4 square for a potential central pawn break. Targeting black's knight immediately sparks an imbalance and dictates the game's early direction. Embracing the dragon, black aims to fianchetto the bishop, creating fierce diagonal pressure and disrupting white's pawn structure before it fully solidifies. Securing the monarch establishes a solid foundation, allowing for future aggressive maneuvering and defensive flexibility. Developing the bishop to g7 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for kingside castling, reinforcing black's defensive structure. Establishing central influence and preparing for pawn advances toward the kingside, while maintaining flexibility for knight deployment. Developing the knight here challenges white's bishop and prepares for queenside expansion, opening up possibilities for pawn breaks. Stealing space in the center with the pawn creates a pawn chain that can become a powerful attacking battering ram, but it also exposes the square d6 to potential knight incursions and demands careful attention to king's safety, as black's queenside development will now be less fluid. Gambiting a pawn for activity, the knight boldly infiltrates the kingside, disrupting white's harmony and aiming to exploit the exposed f2 square. Shattering black's pawn structure opens crucial diagonal lines for your pieces, creating immediate tactical opportunities and potentially a lasting queenside advantage. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen now frees the d-file for potential future action and creates a pawn chain that can offer some central solidity, though it does concede doubled pawns. Opening the e-file with the rook immediately targets black's pawn structure and hints at future kingside pressure. Securing the monarch is paramount, and castling accomplishes this while bringing the rook into play, a vital step in fortifying the king's flank and preparing for potential pawn storms that white's e5 push hints at. Developing the pawn to d3 solidifies white's central presence, creating a robust pawn chain and opening lines for the c1 bishop, while subtly preparing for future queenside expansion. Shifting the knight back, black abandons the bold central foray, aiming to re-establish pressure on the now weakened light squares that white's bishop exchange inadvertently created, perhaps eyeing a future bg4 to harass the queen. Challenging the knight's advanced outpost with this pawn advance aims to disrupt black's well-placed attacker and potentially gain space on the kingside. Preparing to challenge white's central space advantage and develop a queenside presence, this move sets the stage for a potential queenside expansion. It subtly probes the long diagonal, aiming to create counterplay and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Shifting the knight to the forefront aims to exert pressure on the queen side and potentially create attacking opportunities on the king, though it leaves the f3 square somewhat vacant for now. A bold repositioning, the knight abandons its central presence, aiming for a more active role on the flank, potentially eyeing weak squares or initiating an attack on the queen side. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion, this maneuver aims to build a stable pawn chain and restrict black's central activity, potentially leading to an endgame where white's spatial advantage might become decisive. Embracing the diagonal, black repositions the bishop to a6, a strategic retreat designed to put pressure on the c4 square and prepare for potential queenside expansion. It's a patient maneuvering piece, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps exploit any weakness created by the recent pawn pushes, subtly shifting the game's focus. Injecting aggressive intent, white boldly advances the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's queenside control and create attacking chances on the kingside. This pawn push, while creating an immediate spatial advantage and threatening to dislodge the knight on f5, simultaneously weakens white's own king's defenses by opening lines. The tension black can create with their bishop on a6, now supported by the knight's retreat, becomes a critical factor. White has opted for direct confrontation, hoping to exploit the temporary disarray in black's camp, but must remain acutely aware of potential counterplay and the safety of their monarch. A surprising retreat, the knight embarks on a journey back towards its starting square, seemingly abandoning the central territory it had briefly contested and creating a slight weakness on the light squares it covered. Launching an assault on the queenside pawn structure, this thrust immediately aims to dismantle black's seemingly solid setup and open lines for white's pieces. Black embraces the challenge, accepting the central pawn exchange to unclutter the queenside and potentially open lines for the queen and rooks. This decision hinges on whether the subsequent activity black can generate outweighs white's increased space and potential for pressure down the d-file. It's a brave step that demands precise calculation and dynamic counterplay from black's side to justify the positional concessions. Opening the central file immediately after black's pawn capture unleashes fresh attacking potential, forcing a crucial decision about how to react to the sudden increase in tactical lines and potential pressure on the queen side. Unleashing the pawn storm feels aggressive, but it dangerously weakens black's kingside pawn shield, potentially creating lingering structural vulnerabilities that white can exploit later. Striking at the pawn chain opens lines and creates immediate tactical opportunities, forcing black to confront the consequences of their pawn push. Recapturing the pawn with the f-pawn opens the f-file for your rook and bishop to potentially exploit, a crucial step in challenging white's centralized kingside presence. Unleashing the queen to attack the d6 pawn and simultaneously eye the a6 bishop, white boldly shifts focus towards the queen side, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and create immediate threats, while sidestepping any potential knight maneuvers on the king side. A tactical rethink emerges as black repositions the bishop, aiming to connect rooks and potentially shore up the weakened kingside pawn structure before white consolidates. The monarch's sanctuary is suddenly exposed as this aggressive royal check disrupts black's delicate pawn structure and forces an awkward response, potentially leading to open lines and active piece play for white. A curious retreat for the knight, abandoning the aggressive central outpost it had bravely established and heading back towards the kingside, potentially aiming to rejoin the defensive effort around the monarch, but it leaves a lingering question about its ultimate purpose and the tempo lost in this meandering journey. The bishop's journey to f4 orchestrates a delicate regrouping, aiming to bolster control over the d6 square and prepare for potential advances on the king side, while simultaneously eyeing the e6 pawn as a future target. Unraveling the center, black seeks to activate their queen and challenge white's kingside pressure, aiming to exchange pieces and simplify the position while creating counterplay against white's somewhat isolated d-pawn. Initiating the queen trade now, after much maneuvering and positional jockeying, signals a decisive shift towards the endgame, potentially simplifying the board to exploit white's slightly more active piece placement. The pawn structure is now significantly altered, and black's central pawn presence has been diminished, yet this recapture opens the c-file for potential counterplay and eases the pressure on the queen side. The knight now decisively occupies the central outpost at d6, threatening both the weak pawn on c7 and the bishop on b7, forcing black into a defensive posture and disrupting their coordination. Reclaiming the center and simplifying the position, black aims to equalize the material balance by offering an exchange, acknowledging the slightly awkward placement of white's knight on d6. This maneuver also frees up black's rook on f8, potentially activating it on the open d-file or on the 7th rank. Exchanging bishops here solidifies white's central pawn structure and prepares to activate the queen's rook along the open d-file, aiming to pressure black's isolated d-pawn and restrict the opponent's minor pieces. The rook embarks on a journey, aiming to exert pressure along the open c-file and potentially support a pawn advance on the queen side, seeking active counterplay in a position where white enjoys a slight material and positional edge. A bold foray to infiltrate black's queen side, aiming to disrupt their coordination and potentially target the weak pawns. Securing the king's immediate vicinity becomes paramount with this defensive maneuver, creating a crucial pawn barrier against potential frontal assaults and buying valuable time to organize a more robust defense. Repositioning the rook to the open file consolidates control, placing pressure on the d-pawn and setting up potential battery formations along the rank. Intensifying the central pressure, Black seeks to challenge White's dominant rook on e6 and prepare for a potential breakthrough. This move, rd8, isn't about immediate fireworks, it's a subtle repositioning. Black acknowledges the compromised pawn structure on the king side and the potential for White's rooks to become overwhelmingly active. By bringing the rook to d8, Black aims to create a more solid defensive setup. It's a proactive step to improve the piece coordination and prevent White from steamrolling down the e-file unopposed. Notice how this also prepares to potentially exchange rooks, a common strategy when facing an opponent with superior piece activity. This demonstrates an understanding of endgame principles, even in this middle game position, and a desire to simplify the position to alleviate the pressure. Seeking to pry open lines and activate the knight, White repositions for a more dynamic game. A subtle yet crucial repositioning, aiming to fortify the monarch against potential attacks down the open g-file and prepare for eventual piece activity on the king side, hinting at a desire to contest White's initiative. A bold repositioning aiming to disrupt Black's nascent queenside pressure and potentially exploit the weak light squares around the king once the bishop gets established. Reclaiming the central square for the bishop, this maneuver aims to redeploy the piece to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing weaknesses on the queen side or providing support for future pawn advances. The rook's aggressive repositioning to the 8th rank immediately threatens to shatter Black's defensive structure, creating a powerful invasion point and potentially isolating the king. An unavoidable liquidation, this exchange on the open file, though seemingly passive, fundamentally alters the landscape, setting the stage for a potential endgame where control of the d-file will become paramount. The endgame is now firmly established, with White's rook poised to exploit the now open file created by Black's last move. Its presence on the 8th rank promises future pressure. Initiating a desperate attempt to untangle the pieces from their current predicament, Black seeks to reactivate their beleaguered bishop and potentially offer some counterplay, though the rook's current positioning offers little immediate defense for the king. Capturing the open file with the rook immediately asserts dominance on the 8th rank, a powerful statement of intent. Black aims to immediately contest the open file and disrupt White's impressive rook presence on the 8th rank. Sacrificing pawn integrity on the king side to create a dangerous outpost for the bishop, aiming to exploit Black's weakened pawn structure and potentially generate a breakthrough on the queen side. Embracing the challenge, Black initiates a pawn thrust with the aim of disrupting White's queenside pressure and seeking active counterplay against the exposed White king. This bold advance, while potentially opening lines, also carries risks if White can successfully exploit the pawn's new vulnerability. Opening the g-file provides an immediate tactical opportunity, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially expose the king. This aggressive pawn sacrifice could lead to a dangerous initiative if Black is caught unprepared for the ensuing complications. Gaining essential breathing room for the knight on f7, this maneuver aggressively challenges White's pawn chain and seeks to dislodge the imposing bishop on c3. The knight scurries back to the relative safety of g2, a tactical retreat necessitated by the pawn storm's momentum, now eyeing a potential re-entry onto the king side if Black overextends. Reclaiming central influence and preparing to harass the isolated d4 pawn, Black reestablishes a piece on a more active diagonal. Reclaiming the initiative through central influence, the knight's repositioning to e3 signifies a determined effort to establish a more robust central presence, directly challenging Black's potentially dominant bishop on c8. This maneuver aims to neutralize the active bishop and prepare for a subsequent pawn push or a regrouping of pieces to support the king. It's a subtle but crucial strategic shift, seeking to exploit any lingering positional weaknesses after the recent exchanges and pawn advancements, ultimately striving for a more harmonious piece coordination and improved attacking potential. Recentralizing the bishop here offers a fresh perspective, aiming to disrupt White's knight outpost and potentially create new avenues for attack against the somewhat exposed king. Asserting dominance on the b-file, the rook finally activates after a prolonged period of relative inactivity, directly challenging black's pawn structure and creating immediate threats that black must now contend with, potentially forcing concessions or a critical defensive maneuver. This pawn thrust opens a dangerous diagonal towards white's king, simultaneously reinforcing the queen's pawn and threatening to infiltrate further. White aggressively probes the pawn structure, exploiting the exposed king and aiming to disrupt black's coordination. Sacrificing material for initiative often leads to sharp and unpredictable positions, and this capture certainly injects a dose of chaos into the game as black aims to disrupt white's rook battery on the 8th rank. Shifting the monarch towards safety is a prudent reaction, acknowledging the looming pressure and the need to secure a vulnerable king amid the tactical crossfire. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, black aims to generate counterplay and disrupt white's kingside structure, hoping to exploit any weaknesses that arise. A prudent repositioning of the rook to eye the pawn structure, aiming to disrupt black's increasingly precarious king safety and exploit the open file. Pushing the pawn creates a potential barrier for the white king and simultaneously opens a dangerous avenue for your own monarch, aiming to escape the suffocating pressure on the kingside and maybe even participate in the dwindling action. Snatching the unprotected pawn has the immediate effect of increasing material advantage, but leaves white's rook completely exposed on the open file, begging for a counterthrust that could unravel their current pawn structure and potentially target the king. The king, freed from its castled sanctuary, now boldly steps into the fray, initiating a daring maneuver to rally its forces and potentially exploit the exposed white king. The king's relocation to e2 initiates a bold reshuffling, aiming to activate dormant pieces and exploit the open d-file, potentially forcing concessions from black's somewhat passive structure. Seizing the chance to consolidate, black repositions their bishop to the central d4 pawn, creating an active defensive structure and offering an immediate pawn exchange that will simplify the position and potentially lead to better piece activity for black in the resulting middle game. Unlocking the diagonal for the bishop dramatically increases pressure along the rank, forcing the black king into a more exposed position while simultaneously creating new attacking avenues. Seizing the opportunity presented by the rook's temporary absence, black snatches a pawn and introduces a serious distraction to white's queenside, aiming to disrupt any coordinated attack white might have been planning. Attempting to lock down the queenside pawns with that rook maneuver might be a touch optimistic, given how exposed the king has become. The bishop now retreats, no longer a target, but what an opportunity missed for white to have driven it deeper into the position after its aggressive foray. The white rook, now liberated and active on the 7th rank, actively harasses the black king, forcing a retreat and potentially setting up further pressure along the open files. The black king, now exposed to the relentless gaze of white's pieces on the open diagonal, must scramble to find safety. The bishop scurries to offer its support, aiming to shield the king and perhaps orchestrate a more coordinated defense against black's advanced pawns and the lurking rook. Black's bishop relocates, seeking to solidify the pawn structure and support a potential queenside advance while simultaneously protecting the 8th rank. The king cautiously retreats, seeking refuge behind the pawns and preparing to regroup forces for the upcoming struggle. The bishop's retreat to d4 aims to solidify the central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances, though it also surrenders the initiative temporarily. Centralizing that knight with nxd5 significantly alters the board's geometry, aiming to dislodge black's bishop from its influential diagonal and potentially opening up lines for white's own pieces. The rook's aggressive foray to the 3rd rank, though seemingly active, opens up the king's defense and invites an immediate counterattack. Preserving the rook on the 7th rank grants crucial ongoing pressure against black's weakened kingside pawn structure. Seeking to exploit the exposed white monarch, the bishop advances, offering a check and aiming to disrupt white's already shaky coordination, hoping to sow further disarray amidst the scattered pieces. Unleashing the king from its protective cocoon invites a sharp reckoning with black's active pieces, a daring gamble to seize initiative despite black's clear material advantage and positional pressure along the third rank. The king's exposed position is now severely exploited as the knight delivers a crushing check, forcing the monarch into an even more precarious spot and opening lines for decisive material gain. The king scurries to safety on the g-file, acknowledging the immediate threat from the rogue rook and the lurking bishop, preparing to regroup for the inevitable endgame exchanges. This desperate check aims to disrupt white's consolidation and perhaps force a perpetual check if white isn't careful with the king's retreat. Black is hoping to exploit any lingering weaknesses around the white king that have developed from the aggressive pawn push earlier. It's a last-ditch effort to sow chaos in what has become a winning endgame for white. A desperate attempt to escape the mating net, this retreat only concedes more space and invites further dissection of white's already compromised position, leaving the king exposed to a swift and decisive conclusion. A desperate king hunt, forcing a perpetual check with the rooks, now turns into a potential stalemate trap if white isn't careful with the perpetual motion of his rooks around that exposed monarch. The king abandons safety again, seeking refuge from the perpetual checks that have defined this endgame. But continuing this dance risks further exposure and potentially a quicker path to a losing position if black finds a tactical sequence to exploit the centralized monarch. Recognizing the perpetual check opportunity now presents the most straightforward path to a draw given the stalemate potential. A bold gambit to reclaim the initiative, aiming to restrict black's king and sow chaos in the queenside pawns. The checker offers a desperate, yet potentially annoying, check, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated position and perhaps force a draw by repetition if white isn't careful with their king's safety, or if the material imbalance can be leveraged. Seeking refuge for the king while simultaneously defending against the pesky bishop's diagonal threat, preparing to potentially consolidate the remaining material advantage. Sacrificing the rook for the bishop opens lines and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially creating counterplay with the remaining passed pawn. The knight's return to a central outpost after a long journey immediately creates a potent threat to black's awkwardly placed bishop, forcing a reaction and simplifying the material situation. A final desperate attempt to disrupt the king's sanctuary, though the advantage is overwhelming and the endgame is all but decided for white. The king scurries to safety, seeking refuge from the encroaching darkness as a desperate stalemate threat looms. Exposing the opponent's king to further checks, this knight's sacrifice aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for potential counterplay in the endgame.